On January 22nd, 1808, a ship docked in the port of Salvador, on the northeastern coast of Brazil. Besides carrying artworks, documents, books, and money, lots of money, perhaps the vessel's most precious cargo was Maria I, the Queen of Portugal. As she stepped off the ship after a long voyage from Lisbon, she became the first European monarch ever to set foot on colonial American soil. Escaping the Napoleonic invasion of Portugal, the monarchy, led by Maria's son, Prince Regent Dom João VI, sought to keep a hold on their power by sailing across the ocean to the colonies. Dom João's plan was to expand the Portuguese reign in Brazil, its biggest colony. Rich in gold with fertile soil and unmatched beauty, it was the empire's crown jewel. But 14 years later, the precious gem fell off the Portuguese crown. On September 7th, Brazil will celebrate the 200th anniversary of its independence from Portugal. Riddled with family betrayals and historical inconsistencies, this period in Brazil is a truly peculiar and fascinating one, especially when compared with its Latin American neighbors. Independence elsewhere on the continent was a story of revolutionaries and republics. In Brazil, it was a story of the emancipation of a prince from his father and the independence of a country that did not exist yet. In this special mini-series, we'll walk you through the eccentricities and myths of this period, its legacy in the country 200 years later, and how Brazil became Brazil. I'm Caroline Coutinho of the Brazilian Report, and this is 1822, a special 4-part series about how an independent Brazil came to be. Dom João VI did not come to Brazil alone in 1808. With thousands of members of the royal court and thousands more civilians, the Portuguese arrivals doubled the population of the city of Rio de Janeiro, where they eventually settled. To account for the growing demographic, the city was transformed. Ornate fountains, bridges, and sidewalks were constructed. Roads were widened, streets were illuminated, and buildings were erected. Colonial facades were demolished and renovated, making way for the city's new imperial architecture. Grand public spaces began to adorn Rio de Janeiro, like the sprawling flora of the city's botanical gardens, which remains preserved to this day. Lined with palm trees and hidden grottos, the gardens were built as a sanctuary for foreign species of vegetation and a spectacle of floral beauty, much like the city itself. Travelers who were once disgusted by the immorality and rusticity of Rio de Janeiro now flocked to the city to admire its beauty. As Professor Kirsten Schutz of Seton Hall University titled her book on the construction of Rio de Janeiro, the city became a sort of Versailles of the tropics.
Rio is no longer the capital of a colony. Rio is the capital of an empire. It's becoming metropolitan, right? So what does that mean? It means, on the one hand, investing in the city's infrastructure and, really practical things, right? They need more public fountains. They need to build transportation infrastructure. They need to attend to the problem of hygiene, right? As the city begins to grow over the period of a few years, right? The records suggest that the city's population doubles. Right, so that's a dramatic increase in demands on infrastructure that that officials seek to meet, and the institution that is at the center of this effort, I would argue, is a new institution created when the court arrives called the Intendancy of the Police, and it was modeled after the Portuguese or the Intendancy of the Police that was in Lisbon, which was created in around 1760. That institution was itself modeled after French policing institutions. And all of these have a really broad understanding of policing as both, providing security and safety, but also the well-being of the people living in the city. So the police intendancy ends up being in charge of a lot of that, the infrastructural improvements, or the task of supervising improvements in the city's hygiene and so on.
These projects were largely funded by donors within Brazil's existing elite, made up of merchants and plantation owners who profited from the colonial trade. A wealthy slave dealer, Elias Antônio Lopes, notably gifted his farm estate in São Cristóvão to Dom João upon his arrival. The palace, featuring elaborate molded plasterwork and decorative paintings, served as a royal residency for almost a century. Bought, built, and maintained by slaves, the Quinta da Boa Vista characterized the paradox of the newly imperial Rio de Janeiro.
There are the people that come on that first fleet with the royal family. There are exiles that come in the years that follow. But it also is an increase in the enslaved population of the city, right? So, of course, there is this, once again, this agricultural economy that's growing around the city that demands, or that is based on, enslaved labor. But there's also an increase in a demand for enslaved labor in the city for services, right? For the labor that's being used to expand the city's infrastructure. For the labor that's being used in what we would call a kind of service economy. So the question of how Rio becomes metropolitan, I think, or how Rio becomes the capital of an empire, is really closely linked as well to how people grapple with the fact that Rio, there's this sort of self-conscious interest in Europeanizing the city, or of making it more European, at the same time that the city also becomes more African, right? Because of the arrival of many people coming from Africa.
And of course, Brazilian aristocrats were not merely being charitable to the visiting monarchs. Now they were finally in the Americas. The previously voiceless elites had the opportunity to cozy up to Dom João and his court.
Chroniclers point out that the king's ceremonial hand kissing, called the beijamão, became this very frequent and very well attended event in the city, right? So that, if you had simply wanted to make an appearance to remind the king who you were, but also if you had, something that you needed taken care of, or a request, right? Now there was this opportunity.
And the hand kissing paid off. Finally, after the arrival of the Portuguese court, Dom João opened up Brazilian ports for trade with all friendly nations, ending the territory's colonial pact. No longer having to exclusively trade with Portugal, profits soared to Brazilian aristocrats. Not only did merchants gain access to new trading partners, but the opening of the ports meant the suspension of previous bans on domestic manufacturing in the colony. A new industrial class was forged, and so was a national economy. And Brazil's autonomy only grew from there. Aristocrats became comfortable with their royal favorability and with the court set up in their new tropical home. Even after Napoleon's defeat in Europe, the Portuguese looked at their increasingly wealthy and established colony and began to ponder over its place in the crown's empire.
Not only Dom João, but some of his royal counselors, right? Some of the men closest to him, advising him, had themselves come to see Brazil as a kind of haven that was perhaps, better conceived in the long term.
So the question was asked, with peace in Europe, should they stay or should they go? Should the Portuguese court return to its traditional moderate path in Lisbon, or stay in Brazil, continuing to relish in its continental territoriality, freedom, popularity, and riches? Decisively indecisive, in December of 1815, Dom João decrees that Brazil would become a part of the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves.
This is a decision that put Brazil and Portugal in the same political level.
Professor João Paulo Garrido Pimenta, a historian at the University of São Paulo and author of the book e deixou de ser colônia, and it was no longer a colony.
During 3 centuries, Brazil was a Portuguese colony. Now, in 1815, Brazil was a kingdom in the same political level as Portugal.
Yet, this increasingly closer relationship between the court and Brazilian nationals was not popular on the other side of the Atlantic. Professor Hendrik Cray of the University of Calgary describes the jealousy brewing back in Portugal.
Because now so much of the spending of the royal court, that sort of thing, is now concentrated in Rio de Janeiro. So because they're needing to to house all of these people want to start building houses in time. They're the spending of the monarchy, all of that. So much of it's now happening in Rio de Janeiro. They're setting up all of the administration of the Portuguese Empire, everything from libraries to archives to the treasury and the various other ministries. All of that is now happening in Rio de Janeiro. And if I can sort of bring in a little anecdote that was kind of interesting for me years ago in my time of dissertation research. I was doing various things in the National Archive in Rio de Janeiro and was looking through some of these sort of uncatalogued material on military affairs that I was interested in. And suddenly there came this box of material that was all about appointments to government posts in Mozambique, which I had never really thought. But of course, in the 1810s, Mozambique is governed from, or at least the Portuguese areas of Portuguese control in modern-day Mozambique, the colony, are governed from Rio de Janeiro. So that was one of those reminders of, this really is a different regime here. And that speaks, I think, to the way that the Portuguese elite, who are obviously not as happy about this once the French are finally expelled.
Ignore and abandon, revolution was afoot in Europe. After a military insurrection in the Portuguese city of Porto, liberal constitutionalists across the empire's old capital demanded the monarchy's return. Under immense political pressure and threats of republicanism, Dom João VI caved. In 1821, the royals retraced the route they had sailed only 13 years before. The arrival in Brazil had marked an event of historic proportions, both in significance and in effect. A monarch had not only resigned in, but revolutionized an American colony. Yet they hoped to continue their rule from abroad, just as they had done before. But the changes they left in Brazil were irreversible. 13 years of growing profits, importance, and independence. Portuguese revolutionaries wished to return to status quo, to recolonize the territory and strip it of its decades of glory. But of course, the cat was out of the bag. The monarchy wished to strengthen its hold on Brazil during their stay, yet it had only exposed it to the ideas of liberty and power. The colony got a taste of independence and it was hungry for more. But who would offer that freedom to the monarchy? Well, another member of the royal family. On its return to Lisbon, the royal family left one member behind. Dom João's son, Dom Pedro I, was appointed the Prince Regent of Brazil, tasked with overseeing and controlling the territory. And control it he did. In fact, the king's son led the Brazilian movement for independence from his own father and from the crown that he once wore. In episode 2, we'll see how a prince became a king. 1822 was written and produced by Eric Zachman, edits and fact-checking by Ewan Marshall. As always, we'll ask you to give us a 5-star rating wherever you get your podcasts. It only takes a second and it will help us reach a broader audience. Or, better yet, sign up for the Brazilian Report, the journalistic engine behind this podcast. We have a subscription-based business model, and your subscriptions fuel our journalism and keep us going and growing. If you're already a subscriber, then you can give us some extra support by filling our coffee mugs with donations on Buy Me a Coffee. This membership program offers special perks like behind-the-scenes content and exclusive newsletters. Go to buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report for more. We want to thank our Buy Me a Coffee members, Felipe Saito, José Rosi Stankovic, Gabriela Graf Ines, Emerging Market Muser, Yaden Iftar, Tonica Thompson, Anderson da Silva, Kat Kramer, Fra, Peter Suffren, Anna Lan, and someone who chose to remain anonymous. I'm Caroline Coutinho, thanks for listening, and I'll be back with episode 2 of this 4-part series.